Welcome to the Il Duce podcast, a podcast on change and legacies in Italy. I'm your host Diego, and in this episode, we will cover political violence and political reform in Italy. On the 2nd of August 1980, at 10:25 in the morning, a bomb exploded in Bologna at the railway station. As the dust settled, it became clear of the scale of the tragedy. 80 people had been killed in what was Europe's biggest terrorist attack until 2004. Who carried out the attacks remain relatively unknown to this day. It is suspected that it was the far right, and opinions remain divided. The 70s and 80s saw a huge upheaval in political violence as both left-wing and right-wing terrorists served to undermine the Italian state and democracy. It was a time of conspiracies and plots, as Italian democracy was perched precariously over the edge. The failures of state building and the winding down of the miracle left many dissatisfied. This was also a time of social revolution and institutional change. Everything from schools to family were all transformed. However, it had come at a significant cost, and a cost that weighed down the Cold War system till its dying days. This is a story of the legacies of failure and the blood that was spilt. The economic miracle did not last forever. In the mid to late 60s and by the 70s, it was truly dead. Wage rises, energy crises, and an expansionary monetary and fiscal policy led to a huge rise in debt and inflation. The rose-tinted view of the world, if it existed, was beginning to fail, and Italians soon realised the continuity that existed in all sections of Italian society. Several institutions such as prisons had not been reformed for nearly a century. The continuity in the courtrooms and security services had not gone unnoticed by Italians, and there was a growing pressure to reform the institutions of old. Facing pressures from all sides, institutions were modernised and reformed with competent and modern reforms, putting to rest the myth that Italy was unreformable. The first institution to really face a crisis was the church and its strong system of morality. The 50s and 60s were the beginning of a morality crisis that would stretch well into the 70s as the forces of modernity clashed with the forces of old. Many felt that Italy was modernising so fast that crucial values were being lost, while others argued it was going too slowly. Moral panics gripped the nations as films were censored or altered. However, the first true battle surrounded marriage, divorce, and the family. Marriage and divorce became the first focus for many. Some tried to preserve what they believed was a central pillar to Italian society. The first real scandal occurred in Prato in 1956. A couple decided that they would be married, but not through a religious ceremony, but rather through a civil one. The local bishop did not take this kindly and accused them of partaking in concubinage and extended the definition of sinners to the family of the couple, which banned them from allowing them to take holy water and communion. The couple took the step of suing the bishop for defamation and won. It became a national scandal as the two Italies clashed. One side stood the more conservative church and the values, and on the other side stood the values from the miracle, the modernization values that wanted to push Italy forward. Another series of high-profile scandals helped to open up the debate even further. The White Lady adultery scandal involved the world-renowned cyclist Fausto Coppi, and it rocked Italy. The treatment of his mistress, represented as a gold digger and a man-eater and demonized by the legal system to many, was justified, whilst others this affair exposed Italy's outdated legal approach to marriage. Even the communists did not escape this moral crisis. Togliatti, the famous leader of the PCI, left his wife for a much younger woman, and it appeared that the PCI had two moral standings, one in public which stressed opposition to divorce, and another private one which let its members do what it wanted. The battle for divorce exploded onto the national scene when, out of nowhere at the end of November 1969, a divorce law was passed in the lower house with a slim majority that legalised divorce. This was obviously bitterly opposed by the Christian Democrats and the church, who decided to trigger a referendum in 1974 against this law. A total of 32 million valid votes were cast, or about a turnout of 88% of those registered to vote. 59% defied church orders and backed divorce. Couples now could get legally divorced. The church and the DC had scored a massive own goal, and were left reeling as the clutch of the church and society slowly collapsed. With the change in divorce laws and marriage, came the change in the structure and legality of family. Family has and will always be important for Italians. It is a refuge in which Italians have traditionally found protection. The family is protected and treasured. Commercials always show happy large families together, a symbol of unity and an oasis of stability. Yet the family, despite its importance, changed and is changing to this day. Like everything else, laws surrounding the family were seriously outdated, and to get them changed required an uphill battle. Surrounding rights within the family were still used well into the 1960s. The constitution may have said women have the same rights as men, but judges, relic of an old era, usually did not apply such clauses. Only in the 70s did things start to change. Italian feminism exploded onto the scene. They were instrumental in battling conservative attitudes and pushing for greater rights. Feminism's focus on the private sphere as well as the public sphere undercut church's influences on family. Still, the judiciary often used the constitution to uphold inequalities, such as the right of the husband to force his partner out of work due to the supposed well-being of the family. Divorce may have been legalized, but the immediate impact was actually limited. Family law was severely out of step. Only in 1969 was the idea that adultery was worse when committed by women struck down by law. And laws still existed which undermined the rights of children born out of wedlock. Changes within the family was occurring, but it was slow. Italy was trying to modernise its institutions, but like all changes in Italy, it had to go through an intense period of conflict. This is also shown by the campaign over abortion, that not only clashed with Church and DC, but also the Constitutional Court. In 1975, the court ruled that Article 546 of the 1930 Code, which criminalised abortion, was constitutional. More radical members of the Italian political scene decided to utilise a referendum the very same way the church had done. One side stood the radicals, the feminists and the young socialists, and on the other side stood the church, neo-fascist and the Christian Democrats. The results were overwhelming. Over 68% voted in support of abortion. Italians clearly wanted change and they were going to get it. This period saw the reversal of centuries of church domination over morals. In the span of a decade, the church's powers over family, marriage and abortion had been undermined. It is going to be dragged forwards, kicking and screaming if it had to be. However, this change wouldn't be easy. Whilst divorce and abortion were acquired through relatively peaceful political means, other desired changes were chased through violence. In Italy, the 1970s is not remembered for change, but for intense political bloodshed. The time in which Italy was actually politically reforming was also a time that brutally revealed how little Italy had in fact changed. It was a time of conspiracy and counter-conspiracy, as shadowy forces such as Gladio seemed poised to kill Italian democracy. It exposed the weakness of the post-war status quo. It all began in 1969. Trouble first began to brew up in universities. Institutional inertia surrounding education had meant that schools and universities were extremely overcrowded, and many graduates struggled to find work. An ineffective civil service and a political system more interested in embedding itself into Italian society meant that education remained unreformed. A new class of overeducated, unemployed and bitterly resentful students were born. Their target? The entire Italian state. These students saw right through the facade of modern Italy. Ex-fascists walked the streets as free men, and many students began to link Republican Italy back to fascist one. Beginning in the late 60s, students began to group together and fight back against the state and their own professors. They occupied universities and clashed with police. They elected leaders and worked on ways to improve universities. They began to talk back to astonished professors and interrupted lectures. However, the darkest legacy of the movement was violence. Violence to many students became accepted and normalized. Many had become radicalized and soon came to see themselves as the new partisans. The return of anti-fascism in Genoa in the 1960s, where riots occurred due to the MSI Congress there, burned fresh in many people's minds. To many of the young students, violence soon became the norm. However, the group that fully embraced the legacy of violence was the far right. The MSI in the 1950s soon realized that if it wanted power, it would need to compromise with the democratic institutions, just like the PNF. This decision was hugely unpopular with the more radical wings, which split off. These radical wings were violent thugs. Squadrismo had not died with the regime, and many neo-fascist groups were named after the squads of the 20s and 30s. Italy to them was being turned into a decadent country. Using violence was the only way to change that. Thus, two ideologically opposite groups, both committed to violence, were beginning to grow. The results would be disastrous, and known as the Anni di Piombo, or the Years of Lead. On the 12th December 1969 at 4:37 p.m, a huge explosion ripped through the interior of the agricultural bank in Piazza Fontana. 17 people were killed in total. The attacks were carried out by neo-fascist groups as part of their strategy of tension. By creating chaos and confusion, fascist terrorists hoped to bring back an authoritarian state. Despite evidence pointing to the right, the police immediately turned to the left. It was said that over 4,000 left-wing activists were arrested and interrogated. The police and the judiciary employed large multitudes of ex-fascists. Although they worked under democracy, they were often servants of fascism. Suspicions had always existed that the secret services such as CIFAR were involved in attacks. Police were lenient on the right and harsh on the left. This strategy proved disastrous and inflamed tensions. One of those arrested was a young anarchist by the name Giuseppe Pinelli. He was arrested and taken to interrogation where he was held for 3 days. On the 15th of December, he was found lying on the street below, apparently having fallen 4 stories. Conspiracies soon swirled. The police claimed he jumped and committed suicide, as there was strong evidence implicating his role in the bombings. However, he was soon cleared of any wrongdoing, so why did he fall? The blame soon came to rest on the police, and especially the officer who was in charge of the investigation, a policeman called Luigi Calabresi, who was demonized by the left-wing press. Piazza Fontana and the Pinelli case further radicalized a generation of militants on both sides of the political spectrum. The left believed that fascism was again on the rise, supported by a shady group of fascists and state organizations. These fears were only made worse on the 7th of December 1970, when there was a coup attempt by neo-fascists led by Giulio Borghese. Neo-fascists gathered at strategic points around the cities, and armed forestali waited outside the city. The plan was to occupy public television stations and broadcast to the nation. However, the coup failed. The reasons it failed is actually unknown. Conspiracies exist to this day. The weirdest fact was that no one noticed that this happened until 4 months later. Violence soon became the only answer for left-wing militants to answer this encroachment of the fascists on Italian democracy. Luigi Calabresi was shot dead in 1972, and an endless cycle of violence where both sides saw it as the only means to an end was born. The most famous of these terrorist groups was the left-wing Red Brigades, or Brigate Rosse. They were born from a cult of class violence that came together from a mix of myths linked to the Spanish Civil War, Che Guevara, and anti-imperialistic movements. Their targets was the state and state machinery, which they saw as fascist. They kidnapped neo-fascist trade union leaders, who they accused of breaking up the working class, and a Fiat administrator. In 1973, they carried out their first assassination, killing 2 neo-fascists. However, their assassinations proved to be their downfall. The greatest, and also the action that doomed them as a group, was the kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro. Aldo Moro was an extremely powerful and popular centre-left politician who had served as Italian Prime Minister multiple times. He had helped the DC come to terms with the PSI, and he was well regarded. Moro was kept in a tiny room and was sentenced to death by a people's court. Moro was found dead in the back of a Renault 4 in Rome. The Red Brigade's greatest success also proved to be the beginning of the end for them. The movement's targets became increasingly harder to justify. They murdered magistrates who had investigated neo-fascist terrorists, they murdered left-wing journalists, and even murdered a Fiat worker. These weren't class heroes, they were just murderers. The right responded in tune. Fascist terrorism made up the bulk of all attacks during the years of lead. Their popular base was mostly made up of old fascists and younger jobless men, many from the south. Black terrorists, as they came to be known, were ruthless. They killed anyone who got in their way, and often killed each other. Their preferred tactics were mass casualty events such as Piazza Fontana, and later, most likely, in Bologna. The years of lead were an intensely violent period. Many of the perpetrators of crimes escaped justice. Fascists escaped to Spain, while far-left terrorists were welcomed into France. Even in Italy, terrorists were given relatively light sentences. The wounds festered to this very day. However, its greatest impact was that it exposed the disunity in Italy. Italians stood on opposite ends, stuck in a fierce loop of violence and hatred. All the attempts to unify and modernize Italians seemingly failed. The myth of the resistance and a new identity had not made a new united group of Italians in the same way fascism failed to create a fascist society. Italians had done a complete 360, ending up to the point where they began in the early 1920s. The Italian First Republic seemed weak, afflicted by parasitic mass parties feeding off of it. Its days were numbered. The legacy of its failure was spilt by the blood of the innocent from Bologna to Milan. The 1960s and 70s saw Italian institutions modernize and change incredibly quickly. Moral doctrines that existed for centuries were wiped out virtually overnight. Yet this period is not remembered for reforms. As the dust settled in Bologna, a new Italy emerged, traumatized from its experiences. It exposed to many that Italy was not unified but divided. The party and the political system had survived, but barely. They had struggled to contain violence and had seemingly tried to block every reform possible. Even worse was that even if the institutional changes had rapidly redeveloped civil society, it failed to modernize or reform the political scene. Student protests achieved remarkably little and only fueled violence. Expectations, hopes, and resentment all smashed together against reality. This lack of political reform would cast the end of the First Republic, that was steering its way into a political iceberg, its boilers charged with the violence and bloodshed that had enveloped Italy.